Good morning, and welcome to the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies event on improving tax policy for Black communities. The Joint Center is a research organization focused on providing compelling and actionable policy solutions to eradicate persistent and evolving barriers to the full freedom of Black people in America. Today, we're going to discuss opportunities to eliminate barriers to the economic success of Black people in America through the tax code. The tax code touches everybody in this country, and though the laws that make up tax policy never explicitly mention race, I've learned that the realities of American history and the ways that tax policy is designed and implemented mean that, like many US tax policies, the tax code does indeed tend to affect people of different races in different ways. So I'm excited to be able to bring together these experts today to discuss how tax policy has affected Black communities in the past and how we can ensure that tax policy has equitable impacts for Black communities in the future, especially as we approach the expiration of several of the provisions in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act over the next few years. So we're going to have a discussion, and after our discussion, we'll have time for a short Q&A with the audience. So if you have questions, if things come to mind, use the Q&A feature in the Zoom so that we can pose the question to the folks that we're talking to today. And so I'll get started with introducing our panelists. First, we have Dorothy Brown. Professor Brown is the Martin D. Ginsburg Chair in Taxation at Georgetown University Law Center and author of The Whiteness of Wealth, How the Tax System Impoverishes Black Americans and How We Can Fix It. A nationally recognized scholar in the areas of race, class, and tax policy, she's the author of numerous law review articles, book chapters, and essays on the topic. She's appeared on ABC's The View, MSNBC's Morning Joe, New Yorker Radio Hour, NPR's Marketplace, and PBS NewsHour. Her opinion pieces have been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. We're also joined by Stephen Dean. Professor Dean is a professor of law and co-director of the Center for the Study of International Business Law at Brooklyn Law School. In the forthcoming book, Global Jim Crow, Taxation and Racial Capitalism, Dean explains how racism has long shaped the rules of international taxation, preventing Africa from realizing the promise of decolonization. Dean graduated from Yale Law School, practiced law with leading global law firms, worked at one of the world's largest accounting firms, and led NYU's School of Law's graduate tax program. We're also joined by Bradley Hardy. Professor Hardy is an associate professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. He's also a non-resident senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution and a research fellow with the Institute for Economic Equity at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. His research examines trends and sources of income volatility and intergenerational mobility within the United States with a focus on socioeconomically disadvantaged families, neighborhoods, and regions. He also researches the role of anti-poverty transfer programs, such as SNAP, otherwise known as food stamps, the Earned Income Tax Credit, and TANF for improving economic well-being among low-income individuals and families. And last but not least, we're joined by Janis Bowdler. Janis is the U.S. Department of Treasury's first counselor for racial equity. She spent the last 2 decades advancing economic equity solutions for communities of color and breaking down the barriers that underpin the disparities in wealth and financial security by race and gender. Growing up in Northeast Ohio, she saw firsthand how neighborhood conditions impacted the life opportunities of her families and neighbors, often resulting in an uneven playing field that has left communities of color and our most vulnerable communities at a stark disadvantage. Drawing on her lived experience and 2 decades of working in coalition with Black, Latinx, and AAPI communities, Janis has dedicated her career to dismantling the structural and institutional racism that has allowed the racial wealth gap to persist and widen. So, we obviously have some very highly qualified folks here for this discussion, so I'm really excited to get into it. So I'm going to jump right in, and I'm going to start with Professor Brown. In your book, The Whiteness of Wealth, you explain that although most folks think that the tax system is race neutral, it's actually not. Could you share more about how the tax system disadvantages Black communities and how it got to be that way?
Sure. And the typical mindset is, how can the tax laws discriminate against anybody based on race? Because there's never any mention of race. Well, this is the United States, and race matters everywhere, and it especially matters in our tax laws. So even though there's nothing in our tax laws that say there's going to be a different impact based on race, tax laws were often designed to benefit white taxpayers. As a result, if you care about the racial wealth gap, you have to care about tax policy. What tax policy does is, when white and Black Americans engage in the same activity, buying a home, getting married, getting a job, paying for college, trying to build wealth, when they engage in the identical activity, tax law subsidizes, gives a tax break to how white Americans engage in the activity, while disadvantaging how Black Americans engage in the activity. So here's an example. Take home ownership. First of all, tax subsidies for home ownership only benefit homeowners. And we know in the United States, there's a racial difference in who owns homes. The majority of white Americans own home, as well as the majority of Asian Americans. However, Black and Hispanic Americans, the majority rent. There's no tax break for rent, but there are tax subsidies for home ownership. So the minute our tax laws benefit home ownership, we've got a tax break that's going to be disproportionately received by white Americans, and Black Americans are going to be left behind. But it gets worse. Let's talk about Black homeowners and white homeowners, because you would think that if you became a Black homeowner, then all the tax breaks eligible would be applicable to you. Well, think again, because this is still the United States and race matters. So let's take Black homeowners and white homeowners, and let's take one rule that says when you sell your home at a gain, you get the benefits tax-free. So if I buy a house at 100 and I sell it for 150, I have 50 of gain, and the tax law says that's tax-free. Well, that tax law dates back to 1951. And in 1951, the majority of white Americans are homeowners. That wasn't true in 1940. In fact, between 1940 and 1950, America became a nation of white homeowners being the majority. And of course, we know that's a function of the federal government subsidizing the purchase of white homes by FHA insurance. So as a result of government action, government helped a minority of white Americans become a majority of homeowners. So this tax break dates back to a time when it's really obvious in 1951 who was being benefited. Well, fast forward to 2022, you would say, well, Dorothy, if a Black homeowner sells their house at a gain, they're going to get a tax break. Yeah, except one, most Black homeowners don't sell their homes at a gain. And if they do sell it at a gain, it's a significantly lower gain than if they bought a home where they're white, where the majority of white homeowners do. In fact, what we see is, if you live in a racially diverse or all Black neighborhood, your home appreciation doesn't increase in value the way it would if you were buying in an all white neighborhood. But the flip side of that is, many Black homeowners sell their home for a loss. And guess what? The tax law doesn't allow that deduction. When you sell your home at a loss, you sustain a real loss, but our tax laws don't recognize it. Now, if you sell your stock at a loss, tax law recognizes that. So even when we see Black and white Americans doing the same thing, buying a home, tax law subsidizes how white Americans do home ownership while disadvantaging how Black Americans do home ownership. So I'm going to end my answer by just saying how we get here is a function of history, but it's also a function of racism in 2022.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move to Professor Dean, because I think you also have a different kind of angle on this. In your work, you talk about the global Jim Crow as it relates to the tax system on an international scale. Could you talk a little bit about how inequities play out on a global scale?
Sure, and thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. Grateful to the Joint Center for making this happen. I'm going to start by just answer the question. Start by taking you back to 1960. On December 14th, 1960. So Elvis has the #1 song. James Comey, I think, was born on this day. So a while ago, not forever ago, but a while ago. And this is when the foundations of the international tax system that we are still living with today took shape. And there were two things that happened on that day, and it's kind of a coincidence, but it's kind of not. So on this day, the UN adopted its Declaration for the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. Right, so this is when decolonization was really gaining momentum. But also in the same day, more important for tax nerds, this is the day that the Convention on the OECD was signed. So that happened on the same day, and this was when the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, I'm not making that up, which was formed in 1948 to help with the Marshall Plan, was transformed into the OECD in order to, and this is a quote from their website, in order to strengthen the tradition of cooperation and apply it to new tasks and broader objectives. So what was the broader objective from a tax point of view? Quite simply, it was to make sure that poor countries, and of course at this stage, those poor countries, the former colonies were often Black, were not able to collect tax. So they were gaining formal legal sovereignty, but they were being stripped at the same time of their ability to collect revenues. And even today, one of my co-authors has shown that most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa still collect about 15% of their GDP in tax revenues, when the UN has said that you need at least 20% to grow sustainably. So this is decades on. This is just how deep the damage of this arrangement has been. So to me, it's a fascinating story, and one that's never been told. And I'm telling it in a book that I'm working on. And it's really goes to the question. Dorothy's telling an important story on the personal income tax side, but one way to understand how this story that I'm telling is different is I'm telling the story of why we can't tax Amazon and Google and Apple, right? This seems like it may be something that we're powerless to do. It's something we can't do, but it's really an affirmative choice that was made in the 60s to pursue this very neoliberal, low tax growth model. And we just sort of wonder, why we can't tax these companies. But there's really a pretty clear story. To me, it really evokes Heather McGhee's story of, and the sum of us, of all the closing of the public pools, right? So in the 1960s, these treaties that are really the heart of the international tax system, they were created decades before, like half a century before, by the League of Nations. They were never really adopted. And nobody's really explained why they just exploded in the 1960s, became incredibly popular when the identity of poor countries changed. But I'm going to tell that story. But essentially, the world decided, the rich world decided that if we're going to have to integrate, if we're going to have to integrate our pools, integrate our tax system, we'd rather nobody collect taxes, which I think was not a great thing for anybody in the world, but certainly hit hardest Black Americans and Blacks everywhere in the world. So that's the story. I shouldn't get excited when I tell the story, but I do get a little excited because it's really just so it's so shocking to me that racism anti-Black racism specifically, can inform something so powerful and so large in such a profound way, and go unnoticed for decades. So that's the story I'm going to tell, and I'm excited to do it.
Well, we're excited. We're excited to have the opportunity to read the story soon. Ms. Bowdler, the U.S. Department of Treasury administers the tax system. What have you found during your time at Treasury about barriers to racial equity as it relates to implementation?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really humbling to be on a panel with the people I learn from on tax policy. So I want to thank you for including me and do my best to represent in this esteemed group. There's a couple things that I'll mention right off the bat. I know we're going to get into more discussion, but right at the top, I have to put on the table the insufficiency of our data. Right now, when you fill out your tax form, you do not include basic demographic information, and that has made it really challenging for us to disaggregate tax information by race and ethnicity so that we have a full understanding of the disparities that folks on this webinar are talking about. So that's one thing that we are working on now, and creating an imputation model that will allow us to do deeper analysis by race and ethnicity. I think that's going to be quite revealing and fundamentally important to understanding the impact and the magnitude of disparities created in our tax system. One other thing that I really want to call out at the top is the way that our tax system is increasingly being used as a benefits distribution system. And so we saw that in big ways last year with the advanced child tax credit, which of course is an incredible win for this administration to take the hard lessons of previous recessions where we know that people of color are hit first and have a very long tail on their recovery. And so this effort to go in early and quick with recovery efforts, including taking the child tax credit, splitting it in half, and allowing for monthly distribution, which is great. However, we know that the structural inequities that Doctors Brown, Dean, and Hardy describe or will be describing, like that's baked in then when we think about benefit distribution. And of course, there are a couple of natural barriers. The most vulnerable who we need to be able to get those benefits to likely don't have a tax filing obligation, which means from the IRS perspective, like, they don't have a way to contact them. So when we start to think about the IRS now as a delivery mechanism, then we have to think about how is it structured to reach the most vulnerable Americans, which is not what the implementation apparatus was built for. When we tackled this problem, one of the things that we did was partner with Code for America to create a streamlined portal and then have a full-on engagement strategy with faith organizations, corporate retailers, nonprofit organizations to really support folks who did not have a filing obligation to get on the streamlined portal to be able to access the child tax credit. And the results were significant. That the portal was available in English and in Spanish. According to a survey of portal users, 12,000 portal users, nearly a quarter of them had never filed taxes before in their lives. More than half were people of color. And we estimate that just with the first payment of the child tax credit, it reduced child poverty by 40% and child hunger by 25%. And by the time we got through advanced child tax credit distribution, more than 61 million children had received $93 billion in tax benefit. That, I think what we need to do now is turn the corner on what did we learn about the way that we need to be structuring the tax apparatus to support vulnerable communities for whom this is how we are going to support their very well-being. This is how we're feeding children. And if this is how we're going to feed children, then we need to make sure that that system can equitably reach communities. We know that it has a number of weaknesses right now, and I think we've got, through what we did last year, which was incredible based on the resources that we had, gave us good insight into what we can do going forward.
Thank you. And that actually leads really well into my next question for Professor Hardy. I know a lot of your work focuses on income and wealth inequality. Could
Yeah.
you talk a little bit about why all of this matters for Black
Sure.
households and Black communities?
Yeah, absolutely. And, echoing the other panelists, I'm just happy that we're raising up this issue. Look, I go to start talking about tax policy within my family, and usually that's like a bedtime story. People fall asleep, right? They're like, okay. But we're talking about investments in our families, raising revenue for investments that build up communities. And then increasingly, to the point of Ms. Bowdler, that we're delivering economic assistance through the tax system. And it's a subtle point, but it's a very important one. Look, I think there's folks who have observed that in that regard, the IRS is potentially filling the role of what the traditional cash safety net sort of was doing back in the 80s and early to mid 90s. That could be a longer panel, maybe a follow-up. But I think what's interesting here is that there is this really disturbing history about race and public finance and race and tax policy. In a survey piece that I worked on with Trevon Logan and Jacoba Williams, we were kind of summarizing Trevon's work, basically showing that, for example, during the Reconstruction era, racial violence against Black politicians was directly linked with their proclivity to want to invest more in public resources. That in fact, a dollar increase in per capita taxes would actually raise the likelihood of a violent attack against a Black politician by more than 30%. So there's been this tension about investments that could benefit disadvantaged communities, Black communities, and a pretty strong response against it. Now, you shift forward to today, and I'd say across town, but this is virtual now. The Census Bureau this morning will be discussing income and poverty for the last calendar year in the United States. It's happening today. They'll detail how we did on poverty in 2021. And that's going to focus not just on your traditional welfare programs that a lot of us would think of, cash assistance, food assistance programs, but actually how tax programs like the EITC and the CTC interacted to potentially reduce poverty. And the consistent results are that, in fact, these programs have become increasingly important, very important for reducing poverty, right? Now, I think that there's a broader point around economic insecurity and racial economic insecurity and gaps. I think it's just helpful to help folks understand that it's not just a poverty question. It's earnings, it's income, and it's wealth. You might have individuals and families who find themselves with some episodic poverty, episodic low income. But if they have this store of savings and wealth, say at the parental level, well, then that's an important backstop. And we all know there's events that come up. Maybe a career choice doesn't pan out, job loss, health event, unexpected expenses that come up. And so when you really put all these things together, it tells a story for many Black families where that insecurity runs pretty deep, okay? It's also why a lot of analyses that just focus on income inequality, and I focus a lot on income inequality, but I have to be very circumspect and kind of humble about the fact that that's only a slice of the problem here, right? So, it's not to say that many families aren't, Black families aren't prospering, but at the same time, there is this higher level of economic insecurity, income volatility among Black families amid lower wealth, lower income, lower earnings. And I just say, and I think we'll talk about this a bit more, the tax system has become a really important economic backstop with some limitations. I think we'll get into that later, but it's a fact that might be lost on some observers. So I'm happy we're discussing this.
Thank you. I think the conversation thus far has kind of raised for me how we might think about opportunities to both push back on bad policy and move forward on policy that benefits Black communities. Professor Dean, could you talk a little bit about how the Congressional Black Caucus fought racism in international taxation in the past?
I'd be happy to, and I think that's right. I think it's easy to tell stories of how racism shaped tax policy in bad ways, but it's nice to be able to tell an occasional story about how the Congressional Black Caucus and other Black leaders have made a real impact. So the part of the story I'm telling about international tax relates to something I call the Liberia problem. So the Liberia problem, you can think of in 2000, the same organization, formed in 1960, the OECD created what it called a blacklist, or they didn't call it, but everybody else called it a blacklist, that showed what countries they said were to blame for nobody being able to collect tax, right? So they didn't acknowledge their responsibility in creating the system. They came up with a list of countries, Black and brown countries predominantly. They said were tax havens, gangsters, they mentioned in the New York Times, that were preventing everybody from having nice things, which wasn't the story, but it was a convenient way for them to avoid responsibility for what was happening. And so what the Congressional Black Caucus did was they saw this list of countries and perhaps realizing that Liberia, being in the middle of a brutal civil war, was not in fact making Europe poor. It had its own problems. They fought back, and they wrote a letter to the Treasury Secretary at the time, Paul O'Neill, and Paul O'Neill and George W. Bush backed off of this, really quite, to my mind, quite transparently racist approach. And a little more than a decade later, with Obama as president, Congress took a very different approach to the tax haven problem. They created a neutral approach that goes by the bizarre acronym FATCA that targeted Switzerland, but not Liberia, in trying to prevent tax evasion and combat the tax haven problem. Charles Rankel was the chair of Ways and Means at the time. Obama was president. And to me, I see this as an example of what diverse policymaking with Black leaders involved can do. That is not just, it can prevent harm, right? So they prevented this super problematic blacklist from moving forward, although the EU then lifted it up and pursued that, and still does that today, still has these blacklists and gray lists. But certainly the Congressional Black Caucus had a big impact, and the work of Chairman Rangel and President Obama in creating this system of FATCA that, again, targeted Switzerland, but not Liberia, which the OECD should have done a decade before, but it couldn't quite see the truth of it. To me, it's a really quite inspiring story of what we can do when we have people who are just aware of what's going on in the world, creating these policies. The kind of policies that we heard about today, the advanced child tax credit. These are important policies that are not impossible to make. You just need people who are really dedicated and clear-headed about what's happening.
Yeah, Professor Hardy, could you actually explain how tax credits like EITC and earned income tax credit and child tax credit have affected Black communities and inequality?
No, absolutely. I think that the earned income tax credit, first of all, this program was born out of an effort, probably well over 40 years ago, closer to 50 years ago, to try to offset tax burdens for workers with low incomes, low earnings. And kind of in these big shifts over time, the program's grown to really be this essentially a subsidy for workers with low wages, low earnings. And just it happens to run through the tax system. Doesn't have to run through the tax system, but that's how it operates. So it's delivered at tax time, in the spring. And, at this point, you're talking about, depending on the number of dependent children, and this program tends to really be most generous for workers with dependent children. You're talking about federal refunds on the order of $6,500 or more, right? Maybe $6,700 or more. Now, states have then followed suit. Roughly half the states have their own supplemental EITCs that are pegged to the federal earned income tax credit. And so, that's the effort of a lot of advocates at the state and local level who have pushed for these sorts of benefits. And so what it actually amounts to is that you've got, some workers in some states who receive, say, maybe 30 or even 40% of the federal EITC, earned income tax credit, that they receive. Now, again, depending on the family's circumstances, the design can be helpful or problematic. In general, the program has been doled out on an annual basis. So we have events that occur all year long, right? Things that happen to us on a weekly basis, right? And you see employers who are actually now scrambling to create employee assistance funds, let workers draw down their earnings from a particular day or a couple of days to handle an event. So, if you can't access that resource immediately, for many families, that's a problem. On the other hand, a lot of families report that they like this feeling of having a lump sum payment. It's kind of like you feel like you've got this saved up money and you can throw it at a big problem. So this program has been associated with all sorts of outcome benefits with respect to health, education, overall economic well-being. My own reading of the literature is that this is all about economic resources. We know economic resources matter for improving the well-being of families, individuals, children. Certainly, and Ms. Bowdler kind of alluded to this earlier, the 2021 CTC, for example, was, in my view, a fantastic policy expansion. You're talking about providing periodic benefits of between $3,000 and $3,600 per child. And this was only during 2021, but this was consistent with an expert panel's recommendations, National Academies of Sciences, that really talked about how we could significantly reduce child poverty in the US. And so, my view is that the program was a success. Again, I would say that much of the discourse around making permanent that 2021 CTC ultimately hinged on whether to build in so-called work requirements into the child tax credit. Now, I don't want to oversimplify, but in my view, there's no doubt that some aspects of that discussion and narrative around poverty and work is very racialized, right? Now, at the same time, I'd say, look, a lot of Black Americans work their tails off. And in fact, a lot of the story of Black poverty is working with the need for economic assistance. So it's not a lack of work, but it's where we're working and the conditions. So these programs matter. You're talking about $60 billion in 2021 spent on EITC. On the one hand, that's a lot of money. It tells you something about where and how these resources for economic redistribution are being redirected. At the same time, there's more in tax expenditures within the code, right? It's a big number. It's a gaudy looking number, but we're doing a lot more in terms of loss offsets, mortgage interest deductions, and things like that. I would just say very briefly, in work that I conducted with Jim Ziliak and Charles O'Kayam, we found that at once the EITC is responsible for reducing overall Black-white income inequality. And so that's a good story, maybe between 5 and 15% in any given year between 1980 and today. The caveat is that we've got these big employment gaps between Black and white Americans for a whole host of reasons. And so you only get the earned income tax credit if you're at work or if you're filing. This gets to these issues of challenges with using a tax system like this. And so ultimately, for the very poorest among us, when we compared those racial gaps, we found the EITC was having no effect, and that it might have even been exacerbating Black-white inequality at the very lowest incomes. So multiple things can be true all at once.
And Professor Brown, I see you nodding, and I know you have ideas. So Could you offer up some policy opportunities to improve racial equity in the tax code?
So the first thing I want to say is we need the federal government to publish tax data by race. In this instance, Treasury has been a huge outlier. I could give you homeownership statistics because the Department of HUD provides it. Um, Dr. Hardy could give you statistics on income because the federal government provides it. We know unemployment statistics because the Department of Labor provides it. So uh, Treasury almost stands alone in historically refusing to publish data based upon race. So it's really important for the data to get out there, and it's really important for Black Americans to understand we're not getting ahead, not because we're doing anything wrong. We're not getting ahead because the deck is stacked against us, and those in charge of the deck are not telling us. So once the data becomes public, Dr. Hardy will be able to tell this story to his family, and they won't want to go to sleep because they're going to have nightmares, right? So they're going to want the information. And once the information is public, we will have more people engaged, particularly in the civil rights community, because it's not an obvious problem, right? And as Dr. Hardy says, when you start talking about tax, eyes glaze over. So it's really important to understand economic justice is a 21st century problem, and we need to fix it. And it starts with data. I think it was James Baldwin that said, you can't change everything, but you can't change anything if you don't understand the facts. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, we've had student loan debt in the news. We talked about Pell Grants. One proposal I have is to fund Pell Grants at a 21st century value so that it pays for more of college by enacting a tax on wealthy, not-for-profit colleges and universities like Harvard, Yale, Stanford. So we can tax rich universities who are not admitting as many Pell Grant students as they should be. They're not expanding the percentage of Black and other students of color, even though they're getting this huge break by not having to pay taxes on their income as well as their endowment income. The joke about Harvard is it's a hedge fund attached to a university. So let's tax the hedge fund. And then my final solution I want to talk about is creating a wealth-based tax credit that would apply to any taxpayer with below median wealth. And because of the racial wealth gap, that's going to disproportionately benefit Black Americans because we have very low wealth. And because it's based on wealth, it will pass constitutional muster. So as I talk about in my book, my ideal tax credit would be something I refer to as a reparations tax credit, which would compensate Black Americans for all the extra taxes we've paid over these decades. But the Supreme Court would not find that constitutional, but there's a second best alternative, which is a wealth-based tax credit. And the Supreme Court, until they overturn it, but there's Supreme Court precedent that says wealth is not a suspect classification. Therefore, you can limit things by wealth. Therefore, you can tax wealth in a way different than you can tax based on race. So those are my 3 thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, I am looking forward to learning more about all of those ideas in the coming months. Ms. Bowdler, what work is Treasury doing now to move towards more racial equity in the tax system? And how can the folks that are on this call, I think we have some advocates here, scholars, policymakers, thought leaders, how can they work with the administration to move the racial equity work forward?
A few ideas. Just quickly, Jessica, can you hear me okay? My earbuds just died. So, okay, we're good.
We can hear you.
So one is I want to really endorse what Dr. Brown was saying on the data limitations. It is a major challenge. I'm going to drop into the chat a website, a blog that we posted last year with the latest on what Treasury is doing to actually work with the Census Bureau to impute demographic information on tax data, since your tax forms currently do not collect that data. It's really challenging. I'm sure my colleagues on the panel will understand those challenges much better than even I would to try to dig in. We are making progress there. It's slow, and I think we probably all wish and hope that it moves more quickly. But that is at least a first attempt at this is coming. So I'm excited, and I absolutely agree that it's just a carefully. It is a necessary first step in order for us to move a whole number of other pieces forward. Let me mention quickly two other things. One thing that we haven't talked about yet is the uneven nature of tax enforcement and the tax gap right now. In 2019, the tax gap totaled nearly $600 billion. That's 3% of GDP. And if it goes unaddressed, we expect it to grow to $7 trillion over the next decade. And that shortfall is driven largely by high earners and corporations that accrue income in ways that are hard to detect, especially when we have an under-resourced IRS. So what gets lost here is that you're a regular American, your taxes are automatically deducted from your paycheck. And so it feels like, and it's in fact a different set of rules if you're a wage earner than if you are in a position as an individual or corporation to evade paying your full and fair share of taxes. And that tax gap is critical to funding a number of the things that we're talking about, that funds our expanded child tax credit, our investments in climate, et cetera. So it's pretty fundamental. We're very excited that as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, we have an infusion of resources for the IRS, and fair enforcement is a big component of what we will be looking at. And so I think that's a huge step that maybe doesn't always get talked about when we're thinking about tax equity, but that's significant. It's also, in addition to enforcement, there's also just a customer service element and communicating with the American people. If you're saying like IRS being increasingly in a position to distribute benefits, in order to pull off what we did with child tax credit, like the amount of outreach, staffing customer hotlines in multiple languages to make sure that people get the benefits that they are entitled to. That Congress has said, these are your dollars. We have to make the investments to make sure that those dollars actually reach people. We need to pair that with the data so we can hold ourselves accountable and make sure that those connections have actually been made. The second thing that I'm going to mention that we're working on, and where I really could use the help of people on this panel and those listening in, I mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's really an incredible achievement. I'm excited that this is the fourth time I'm saying like a once in generation investment by this administration. When you look at the American Rescue Plan, CHIPS, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and now IRA. IRA will make our country more competitive, lower health and energy costs, create high quality jobs, lower emissions, includes a number of tax credits to support the development of climate technology, to improve climate resiliency in low income communities, and make climate friendly fixes to residential homes, and both for homeowners and for rentals. None of that is guaranteed to equitably reach communities of color without intentional design around implementation. And one of the things that we are very focused on right now is thinking about the intersections between racial justice and climate justice, and making sure that neighborhoods of color, people of color, homeowners of color are in the position to benefit fully from the tax advantages that are created by IRA. again, that given everything we've talked about the way that the tax system is structured, we cannot assume that the default is going to get us all the way there. And I really need the feedback and community intelligence represented by people both on the panel and listening in to help us think through those design challenges and make sure that we are implementing in a way that's really going to ensure that communities of color who are quite climate vulnerable are getting the full resources and benefit that they deserve as part of this legislation.
Thank you, Janice, for giving us some homework and some work to do over the next couple months and years. I have a final, very quick question for the panelists. And as a reminder, we do have the Q&A open. So if you have questions, please drop them in there. But for a quick round robin, what is one misconception people have when they think about tax reform or racial equity in the tax code? And we will start with Dorothy.
Ooh. So my one misconception is that Black Americans don't pay a lot of taxes. We do. And part of what my work tries to do is put that at the forefront. I was presenting at a conference once. I presented how married Black couples are more likely to pay taxes and married white couples are more likely to get a tax break. And the first comment afterwards was, Dorothy, we know your work is irrelevant because Blacks are poor and don't pay a lot in taxes. That is a common misconception on the left. This was someone from the left saying this to me. So
I'll just chime in. That was a professor of tax law.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, it was. So I think it's really important. And this is where data matters, right? This myth would be dispelled if the data got out there. But the nonsense that Black Americans don't pay a lot in taxes just needs to be refuted.
Okay. That was intense. Professor Dean.
Sure. So I would just say that one misconception is that a tax haven looks like Liberia, not like Switzerland. It's a really pernicious phenomenon. And I even got a little feisty a few years ago and called out President Biden for calling out the Caymans and Bermuda as tax havens when all of his experts knew that he was really talking about Switzerland. And that's been true since the 1960s. You know, when I looked recently at the papers of one of the giants of the 20th century of tax policy, Stanley Surrey, I saw that his internal documents called it the Swiss tax haven problem. But when they went public, they called it the tax haven problem. And people are talking about, you know, Liberia and other Black countries. So it's really a pernicious story and a really dangerous narrative that has been proven incredibly persistent.
Go ahead, Professor Hardy.
You know, for me, it would be how the country conceptualizes family, and that families have been changing in terms of their structure and what that looks like. We have a lot of shared parenting in the US that's not constituted by the standard married two-parent family. And I think the tax system is still very much structured along the lines of married, unmarried. And I think that has harmful implications for many Americans across race and ethnicity, but it also hurts Black American families where there is shared parenting. But because of this structure, you know, many parents won't benefit from these sorts of tax protections, tax resources, tax expenditures. And I think that's something that could change. We could do better on that.
Ms. Bowdler?
Yeah, I'd say the assumption that tax refund distribution has to be a once-a-year event. I think the advanced child tax credit showed us both the power and opportunity created when, as I think Professor Dean mentioned, that there've been panel recommendations on this to make that distribution more even over the course of the year, and we know that it has major implications for well-being. We know that people actually hold major purchases until they receive their tax refund, which may be fine if you're holding that to buy your new car. It's not fine if you're putting off a major medical procedure or something else that is core to the well-being of your family because you're waiting for these dollars to come in. It's not great if you're struggling to feed your family month over month and you get a major windfall in your life once a year. So I think we learned a lot about how we can do this in ways that make perfect sense with advancing child tax credit, and to challenge our notions around how we distribute refunds and benefits to vulnerable Americans.
Thank you all. We have about 3 questions in the chat, so I am going to ask all of these questions together and allow you all to respond. They're not directed to anyone in particular. So 1, do you have any thoughts on state or local solutions to tax inequity issues? 2, how do you all view income and wealth inequality at the top affecting Black communities? And 3, can you share your thoughts on the work opportunity tax credit, which is the only tax credit available to employers to incentivize them to hire individuals from underrepresented communities? How can we better use this tax credit as a tool to promote equitable hiring and recruiting for workers of color? Whoever would like to start.
Jessica, I'll just say very quickly on income and wealth inequality, there are aspects, again, to tax policy and tax reform that might seem a little bit, arcane to the outside observer, but they could really make a dent. And so, for example, Ms. Bowdler referred to, opportunities to better fund the IRS. And so, somebody says that, okay, fine, better fund the IRS. Well, right now, the most complex taxes to audit are those among the wealthiest. They employ very expert technicians to really work on, their filing. And so these are complex situations to look into. There's more resources needed. And why my reading of this issue is that in the absence of the funding, the audits are occurring in counties with a higher proportion of Black residents. The audits are occurring among simpler returns. That's disproportionately more Black families, not solely. This is going to affect everybody, right? But disproportionately more Black families. So this is another aspect of this sort of racial inequality that has this dimension of wealth and race, right? So it touches definitely on what Professors Dean and Brown have been mentioning as well. So it's a slice of this wealth and income inequality issue.
So when I think about state or local solutions, I think about state earned income tax credits, right? So, one of the things we found out with the forgiveness of student debt is there are going to be some states that are going to tax that debt forgiveness. The federal government doesn't, but there are some states that are going to tax it. So state income tax policy is really important when we look at racial inequity. And when I think about income inequality at the top, research on high income or higher wealth Black Americans show even the wealthy Black Americans do not hold their wealth the same way that white Americans do. Wealthy Black Americans have more of their wealth tied up in home ownership. And as I talked about earlier, that's not always the best return on your investment. Whereas wealthy white Americans have more of their investment in the stock market. So even wealthy Blacks wind up paying higher taxes than their white peers. So you just can't income your way out of it. You can't wealth your way out of it. That's what structural racism does. It makes sure that it gets you one way or another.
Anyone else? Okay, we got another 3 questions, and this will be really quick. What would you argue is the biggest priority for both this Congress and the next, and the Biden administration in general, to make the tax system more just? Does anyone have any tips on how to make tax policy and racial equity resonate with the general public? I think related, how do we make taxes an important discussion topic to Black America as a whole?
So I'll just jump in here briefly to say that I think that it's actually much easier to make this issue resonate than you might think. I've heard the IRS described as the sixth largest law enforcement agency in the country. And as far as I know, there are really no safeguards in place at all to make sure that it doesn't engage in, there's no bias in the IRS. It's now got an extra $80 billion. And I know that the goal is to target those at the top, but history shows that that is not the way it always happens. So if you're giving extra $80 billion to one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the world, that doesn't have a great track record of racial equity and enforcement, that should scare the crap out of you, frankly. I don't know how you could get more urgent than that.
And I'd pick up on what Steve is saying. So part of why messaging is really important is the minute you say taxes, literally people's eyes glaze over. But if Black Americans understood how much more they were paying than white Americans, that message would resonate. So this gets back to the importance of the data, but what we do with the data is important because nobody's going to go to a website and find it out. We need op-eds, we need movies, we need Hollywood to decide to take an interest in this, because one documentary or one movie or one, visual would capture the imagination of most Americans. So it's getting the word out, but it's getting the word out to people who know how to message.
We also have, I think, a question about Professor Brown's proposal on the wealth-based tax credit, and then one more on what do you think is the best vehicle to bring awareness to the Black middle class and Black wealthy so that they understand the tax laws that will benefit them the way it's benefiting wealthy whites?
Okay, so the question on the wealth tax credit, it's basically, it would be applicable to any taxpayer who had below median wealth, roughly $100,000, which is 80-something% of the Black community. So as a result, it would benefit the overwhelming majority of Black Americans, and it would be a refundable tax credit. So you get a certain amount, and the amount doesn't matter as much as the concept does, right? I'm really flexible on what the amount would be, but it would be an offset to the taxes you owe. And if you don't owe any taxes, you would get that amount refunded to you. And the benefit of it would be, we see with lots of middle class Americans, they don't just take care of their family, they take care of their parents and grandparents and extended family with siblings. What this tax credit would do would enable those grandparents, parents, and siblings to have some means of their own, which would minimize the amount of income that wealthy or middle class Black Americans are using to support them, because our system of Jim Crow didn't do that.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us. I have learned a lot. I am going to go back and rewatch this video later, probably multiple times. I want to thank all of our panelists. They provided a lot for us to think about today, in the Joint Center leadership, and especially our communications team who helped make sure that this could run smoothly. I've been sending them chats throughout the entire hour. Also, I'm really grateful to the Annie E. Casey Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, whose support helped us make this event happen. So thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope you'll join us for more conversations on tax policy in Black communities in the coming months.